His Majesty King Prachatipak, or Rama VII, gave His Royal Highness Prince Mahidol and Princess Sangwan's youngest son the name. His Royal Highness Prince Bhumibol Adulyadej. Which bears significance in its meaning, strength of the land whose might it is to be incomparable.
Ever since His Majesty assumed the top post as head of state, the magnitude of the problems facing the country has brought with it a seemingly endless load of hard work for him. Even today, when His Majesty is nearing the age of 80, he has never wavered from the moral principles of the sovereign, as has been the case all through the past 60 years.
For the Thai populace in the post-war years, especially after the country had just lost their beloved King Ananda 4 years earlier, the grand coronation ceremony rekindled hope and boosted morale among the people. His Majesty entered the canopy for a ceremonial bath, while His Majesty, seated on the throne inside the canopy, a shower of lustral water consisting of that taken from the 5 holy rivers in India and the kingdom's 4 sacred ponds was turned on over him, according to the royal tradition handed down since ancient times. The water is reminiscent of one of the things His Majesty took interest as well as pleasure in as a child. Grom Luang Washirayanawong, the Supreme Patriarch, poured sacred water on His Majesty. These religious rites seemed a far cry from the subjects of science and engineering His Majesty studied at the University of Lausanne, where he still functioned as Prince Bhumibol, the royal brother, close at the side of His Majesty King Ananda Mahidol, who was concentrating on areas pertaining to ruling and kingship. His Majesty was dressed in full traditional ceremonial royal attire at the Paisan Taksin throne hall, where he was seated on the octagonal throne. From that moment onwards, His Majesty's course of life as royal brother completely changed in the manner no one had foreseen. Even though His Majesty had never prepared himself for the role of a king, the Princess Mother's long years of stalwart and ingenious guidance given to her sons and daughter proved in turn to be of great benefit to the nation. His Majesty received lustral water symbolizing his acceptance to rule over the kingdom in 8 compass points. The burden of kingship compelled His Majesty to divert from science, his favourite subject, to social and political sciences. Besides, as His Majesty became well-versed in languages, both Thai and foreign, the knowledge thus gained was then put to good use. The royal prodigious achievement and benevolence have in later years pervaded the entire kingdom and beyond. His Majesty, seated on the Patara bit throne beneath a 9-tiered white umbrella of state. His Majesty received the gold plate inscribed with his full name. His Majesty is a king who had since his early childhood been significantly influenced by the Princess Mother's inclination for an unassuming, simple lifestyle, rational thinking, moral principles and lifelong learning. Receiving the items of the royal regalia, the royal robes and resplendent garments, along with the royal set of arms, His Majesty took up upon himself all the burden that came with the role of Siamese head of state. He thus officially became the 9th ruler of the royal house of Jakri. At the time, the country was still plagued by poverty, land exploitation, dried up streams and rivers, and threatening diseases. The central government had not been able to tackle their problems, so it was inevitable that the people came to pin their hopes on this sacred ceremony and what was to ensue. In the midst of the grand audience that he gave, His Majesty delivered the vow in uttering his first royal words. We shall reign with righteousness for the benefits and happiness of the Siamese people.
His Majesty told the school principal that the medical supply was meant for the community too, in case someone might need and come for medication. That's what he said. The supply was provided to meet the school's basic medical needs.
Decades ago, our country was plagued by multiple public health problems. Besides, communicable diseases and bad cases of epidemics occurred. Today, these problems are behind us. Aside from feeling grateful for the uncountable instances of help His Majesty had rendered us, how His Majesty tackled the problems is worth studying.
It was one of the times when the hospital at Gawila Army Camp had to handle an unusually vast crowd of patients who came for treatment by the Royal Medical Team accompanying Her Majesty the Queen on a free-of-charge basis. Over 50 years ago, at the time when His Majesty the King began his visits to people living in remote areas, the royal visits used to entail a team of medical doctors who were assigned to tend to the royal family and members of the royal entourage only. However, the sights of sickness among his subjects caused His Majesty to command that the royal physicians extend their services to his people as well.
So many people turned out, His Majesty stressed that anyone with an illness was to come for treatment. Whenever he came, he had a team of royal physicians with him.
With an ever-growing number of sick people who came to meet His Majesty, the Royal Medical Unit was initiated, providing them with general practitioners as well as doctors in various fields of specialization. A good number of those who were critically ill or disabled were registered as patients under the royal patronage.
Some of the hills were out of bounds to common people because danger was too great. Besides, they suffered a lot for lack of doctors up there. That's why His Majesty established the Royal Medical Unit that went by helicopter to treat those people.
His Majesty reportedly gave analysis that the root cause of most poor people's sickness was lack of knowledge regarding public health, ranging from nutrition to first aid. Hospitals or health stations were also lacking. The training program for village medical volunteers was launched as a result. The literate selected few in a community have the chance to be trained in areas such as primary examination and treatment. As it turned out, the approach proved effective in helping ease health problems among the populace living in remote areas.
It did some good health-wise, but the effect cannot be felt immediately. On the other hand, we can control things.
The approach still continues along the guideline His Majesty has initiated. We know it under the project entitled Village Health Volunteer Unit. The criterion is one volunteer for every 15 households.
In the beginning, we needed iron lungs. Just imagine, the things had to be imported. We did not know how to invent one.
As it was an emergency case, His Majesty graciously allotted an amount from his personal fund for the purchase of such iron lungs or other respiratory equipment of the kind to be primarily installed at Silirat Hospital.
It was hydrotherapy. We had to rely on pumping machine to revive different parts of the body muscles in the limbs. A forceful stream of water was directed right at these muscles.
The project required quite a large budget allocation. On His Majesty's initiative, the programmes broadcast on his own radio broadcasting station at Ampon Villa were interrupted at intervals by announcements appealing for public donations for the Polio Relief Fund, set up for the treatment and acquisition of medical equipment. His Majesty also allotted additional funding for the Wajira Longon Hydrotherapy Centre.
Leprosy was spreading among people in marketplaces and such. There was an instance of a beautiful schoolgirl in Konkan province. In her final year in high school, the finger joints started to fall off one by one because leprosy was acting up. In the end, only the stump of her hands and feet remained.
The Director General of the Department of Health at the time briefed His Majesty on a 12-year leprosy eradication campaign.
His Majesty inquired if the campaign could be accelerated. The answer was positive, but only after a research institute had been established, training courses set up for the officials and staff concerned, and research on leprosy conducted. With the support from both Germany and Japan then, the project could be completed within 8 years.
His Majesty immediately granted funding from his personal purse to speed up the campaign. That was Rajprachar Samasai Research Institute. The name given by His Majesty came into being. His Majesty went by boat to preside over the foundation stone laying ceremony.
The location was inaccessible by road at the time. There was mention of the name Wat Klang Suan out there in Prapadang. Even the monks shivered when the disease was mentioned. They would not allow leprosy doctors to enter the temple ground.
2 years passed. The construction of Rajprachar Samasai Research Institute was completed. Again, His Majesty declared that he intended to preside over the building inauguration in person.
The monks had a positive rethink. They recalled that the king had come by boat which moored at the Chowpria river bank and walked there to lay the foundation stone and then back again to the boat. Now that the institute was ready for the inauguration by His Majesty, the monks joined efforts to build a road and invited His Majesty to use it as well as to graciously inaugurate it.
Finding out that His Majesty was going to attend the ceremony in person, doctors could not help being concerned for his health. They were afraid he might catch the infection through the presence of leprosy patients in attendance at the institute.
You might want to ask if His Majesty was put off by the lepers' presence, with their rough skin, physical disfigurement and such. All I want to say is, if His Majesty had minded, he would not have come.
His Majesty's venture that day not only served as a good example for the general public in that it directed people's attention to the attitude people should have towards lepers. It has also illustrated His Majesty's support for physical therapy and plastic surgery after the patients had been completely cured. On that same occasion, His Majesty learned that the children he saw running about were children of leprosy patients.
Astonished, His Majesty asked, "Don't they go to school?" The answer was no. No school would accept them. These children had been rejected.
Asked about the possibility of setting up a school for them, they told me it was not in their area of concern to set up a school for lepers' children. The matter should be handled by the Ministry of Public Health. Needless to say, it was an instance of endlessly shifting responsibility onto others.
His Majesty graciously granted 1 million baht from his own personal fund for the establishment of the school through Tanpiying Dusadi Mala Malakun.
In the end, I myself had to assume the role of a flea, without which what should be done would not be done. What ensued was a school known under a non-suggestive name of Rajprachar Samasai School, under the auspices of Rajprachar Samasai Foundation. His Majesty was later recognised by the World Health Organization WHO for having enabled Thailand to effectively and successfully put leprosy under control.
Along the way, there have been certain complaints as to why the Royal Initiated School for Lepers Children is now solely admitting normal children. My answer is, that's exactly His Majesty's strategy. What good would it do if the school is still there, but will not admit children of normal, healthy parents, while leprosy in Thailand is a thing of the past? Nothing is impossible. Time will show.
Her Majesty the Queen once wrote that originally His Majesty had consented to ascend the throne on an interim basis only, to make sure that the funeral rites for the late King Ananda Mahadon were carried out with due pomp and circumstance. But as it happened, it was the people's love and loyalty that had restrained His Majesty from leaving. Somebody shouted loudly, "Please do not forsake the people." Really, I wanted to shout back, "If the people do not forsake me, how can I forsake them?"
There were times when our country had to fight raging cholera, which critically affected a really large number of the population. It was like a plague. What caused it? Mainly the lack of vaccine. The only vaccine-making machine was at the time Red Cross.
In line with His Majesty's policy, which stresses interdependence and mutual assistance, royal financial support, together with donations for public good, following His Majesty's initiation, was sufficient to acquire vaccine-making machines, which His Majesty later allotted to the Army Medical Science Department, Pra Mongkut Klau Hospital, Sirirat Hospital, among others.
Doctors at Siriraj Hospital did some experiment work trying to produce saline solution, but there were no bottles for it. Used bottles needed to be pasteurized, but we had neither the autoclave nor sufficient funding. Eventually, His Majesty found out about this and he purchased them right away. What you have seen are only some examples of what His Majesty has graciously initiated to help ease public welfare problems in our country. It should be noted that His Majesty's approach covers short-term, intermediate-term and long-term solutions and includes the concern over the impact of diseases on the patients, their family members, as well as the society as a whole.
When I was studying in Europe, I had absolutely no idea what my country was like or to what extent the country related to me. I never knew. At some point, I came to love my people after having been in close contact with them. I also came to realize how great the love was. I was not experiencing any serious homesickness. Nevertheless, what I learned from working here was that my place in this world was right there in the midst of my people, the entire population of Thailand.
Biographical data shows that His Majesty grew up in foreign lands. Thus, when he consented to take upon himself the burden of kingship and the status as head of state, it could be the reason why His Majesty was intent on getting to know his subjects.
Starting in 1954, dense jungles and mountain ridges and cliffs in the remotest parts of Thailand were the spots where the Lord of the Land and his entourage of mixed ages paid their repeated visits.
His Majesty used to ask about the speed hill tribe people walked. Having obtained the answer, he would proceed at an ever-increasing speed.
Distance and height not only added up on the time it took us to walk, they also took a heavy toll of the entourage's physical endurance.
A sole high-ranking official could keep up with His Majesty, but then he looked up above him and fainted on the spot. His Majesty had to bend down to grab him. His name was Sichai. We then alternated between pulling him along and carrying him all the way up to the top of the cliff. Some members of the entourage were gasping for breath, could not respond to radio calls, and they came that often too. A voice would inquire how the persons were getting along. Of course, only the sound of hard breathing was heard in response. His Majesty was having such a good time.
At the initial stage, it seemed His Majesty's first visits to different parts of the country were for the purpose of site surveying, as well as first-hand data gathering to learn the nature of problems his subjects were facing. It could probably be regarded as an orientation to the ensuing royal-initiated projects.
The visits enlightened His Majesty on the geographical features, the people's living quality and the various problems facing the people in each part of the country. These problems varied distinctly. The most fun came when it was time to break for lunch, not at noon, but around 2 p.m.
The road condition along the routes of His Majesty's visits, especially at the beginning of the reign, can be described as undeveloped. Up on high mountain tops, the only access is by air only. Many destination points were deep in the heart of the jungle, on high altitude. Many others could be accessed by dusty laterite roads infested with potholes.
The condition did not bother us much, as we had experienced it before, but it was rough for local officials, like provincial governors and the like. I followed behind and could see how pale they looked sitting there. I mean, they did not faint. They were all sitting in rows when it came to walking up those hills.
Everywhere he went, His Majesty would not fail to see calloused hands folded together high over the owners' heads, in respect to him. Some laid out the most precious piece of cloth they had on the ground, waiting for His Majesty to step on them.
With the king's footprint on it, the piece of cloth would not be used or washed. Instead, it would be neatly folded and preserved at the praying spot where the people keep Buddha's image. On Sabbath day, they will put flowers to pay homage to the sacred piece of cloth in gratitude for what His Majesty has done for the country. Most of them do this.
In highest esteem and with total devotion, people's heads bent down toward the young monarch's feet. This was believed to bring good things to their life of hardship.
I was down on the ground to pay respect to His Majesty when he came down. He actually came directly to where I was sitting. I had never dreamed I could meet him in person. Tears readily rolled down my cheeks. I was overwhelmed to see him.
As His Majesty walked past them, those expectant eyes lit up in stark contrast with the harsh and weather-beaten faces from hard work. Thus, the people's delight and smiling faces could not conceal the traces of sufferings from His Majesty's watchful eyes.
The king knelt down to talk to us, asked how one of us who was blind could come. He said his niece brought him along. Why did you want to come? Was the king's next question. His voice was so gentle and soft. How I loved to hear his voice. He even embraced the old guy.
In the old days, Thailand was once known to be a very fertile land, but in reality there was not a trace of that in what His Majesty saw on those visits. Evidence of abject poverty was everywhere. The people's plight had never been included in any central government surveys, since the areas were hardly accessible by road.
In times of bad drought, we had no rice grains to mill even for our own meal.
His Majesty said once that we were to return the people's affection by our deeds rather than words. By all means, the cause of their sufferings must be tackled. His Majesty came to the conclusion that going places to hand out blankets and clothing to them was comparable to an attempt to fill an ocean. The objective could never be fulfilled. It would be better, he said, for us to see them in person, to inquire through our talking with them and establish where the root cause of their ills lay, why they did not have enough to eat, why rice planting came to zero harvest.
Summer was spent in Hua Hin. Once the rainy season started, His Majesty might travel to Pi Kun Thong. From Pi Kun Thong to Phupan. After an interval, His Majesty would take off to Chiang Mai. That made up a whole year for him. With time, the problems became clear to His Majesty, and development assistance had been planned so as to cover all parts of the country.
During General Prem Din Sulanon's premiership, more than 2 decades later, the government made it a point to help ease His Majesty's burden by accompanying His Majesty on his working trips and working to assist the poor on a more concrete and systematic basis.
General Prem remarked to Ajahn Sanot and Dr. Sumet that it was not right to sit back while His Majesty was toiling in those rough and remote border areas. What more, financial support was also from his own personal pocket. The missions should be the government's responsibility instead. That was how the special task force entitled the Office of the Royal Development Projects Board came into being.
It was very late at night, but the big map was still spread in front of His Majesty. The map was used in a briefing to him on matters happening in the land. Given the fact that His Majesty was well versed in multiple areas of specialization, it could be the reason why he could see things more clearly than others. In any case, it was just the first chapter of His Majesty's visits to the remote areas of the country.
The map you see His Majesty carrying around with him on the trips is in fact the source of data bearing details pertaining to the conditions applying to each individual village in the kingdom, including its vicinity too. His Majesty could make analysis by just consulting his map.
For His Majesty, who could envisage the condition along the routes he was to take, some roads were covered with dust during the dry season. Some were infested with potholes after flooding had receded, and some were in the midst of a dense tropical forest. Nothing of the sort would deter him from taking his trips.
The king had to wade through mud. Mud was on his shoes, inside his socks. He was determined to come. Really, those paths were tough, even for ox-drawn carts. Bumpy, covered with rocks, you know, and quite on a slant too. How his car could have negotiated that, I still wonder to this day.
On the trips, he insisted on doing the driving himself, otherwise he would just walk. He said that was how one would have the feel of the place.
His Majesty made a thorough analysis of the geographical features, altitude, depth, etc. His main philosophy is, whatever you plan or do must reflect the natural environment as well as geographical features applying there.
Traveling by other means of transportation, such as by helicopter, His Majesty would review and revise his maps. He would be very displeased seeing members of his entourage asleep, saying flying by helicopter is a privilege. They should realize that official properties were in use, so falling asleep on it was not the way to optimize their services.
His Majesty was looking at the actual site referred to in the map spread before him the previous night. The people, village headmen and officials representing the government sectors concerned, had a chance to brief His Majesty further so that he could make final corrections or enter updated notes.
You see, they had been out for years. What he did was to inquire with the local people, pointing at the spot of his interest. He would ask whether this or that still existed, if any. He then scribbled some notes before handing them over to army personnel on duty for further actions. I think he was security personnel. I was village headman then. His Majesty asked me if the spot where he was pointing at on the map was called Sub Sombun. Was there a source of water? I told him yes. Well, it's subterranean water, sir. You mean water is available year-round? I said yes.
Development work must take account of the local environment in terms of the physical environment. For sociological environment, we mean certain characteristics which we cannot force people to change. We just go in and find out what the people really want and then fully explain to them.
His Majesty would inquire after the nature of their hardship and then proceed to have a look at the actual physical feature of the area which he would use in comparing it with the data he had obtained from the local people earlier. This is an important process because His Majesty always considers the worthiness of his assistance, whether he should render it at all, or what type of assistance it should be, how, where, etc.
Once he had established the needs and obtained complete data, His Majesty was ready to draw up concrete guidelines for the development or remedial initiatives in consultation with the officials concerned who were present on the trips. He would also reach a preliminary agreement with the local populace on how he planned to help them.
His Majesty often stressed that the royal initiatives only meant royal thoughts, his thoughts, which corresponded with those of technicians and others. At the moment, it was just royal initiative, not royal decree. Therefore, the officials were to take his caution into consideration. When His Majesty left, they would resume their works right away, keeping His Majesty's points in mind regarding suitability, worthiness, and then action.
The government units working for His Majesty during those field trips would conduct further technical studies on the preliminary royal initiatives before making the first detailed draft of what was to be implemented as a royal-initiated project for His Majesty's consideration and comment.
His Majesty would not let us procrastinate on matters concerning his people's sufferings. Sufferings know no weekends nor holidays. He always inquired, even within only a day or two, to find out how far we had pursued the matters.
Each of His Majesty's initiation in a project was arrived at only after he had inspected the place of concern, no matter how difficult it was to get to such a place, and obtained all data pertaining to the respective area. Even so, there have been instances where the royal initiatives did not develop into projects.
Many instances indeed. For example, the people would arise once His Majesty had departed. With his presence, the people were in agreement with almost anything. But when more concrete follow-up action took shape, one would assert his ownership over this piece of land, while others did over the rest. Thus, implementation was hindered. His Majesty would say, "We should not proceed without their consent. We can go somewhere else. A lot of work is yet to be tackled."
Among the large crowd of people who turned out to greet His Majesty, some proved to be quite a disturbance to the officials who were also in attendance there.
Words of caution had been passed on down the line of command of those officials, all the way down to village headmen, to the effect that no petition was to be lodged with His Majesty by any of the villagers in the crowd, as the message being petitioned might be perturbing to His Majesty. Any problem at all could be solved among us. Let us talk it out locally. Most often, it was something along this line. The king quietly told me, "Please do not stand in the way if the people want to hand me a petition. No need to hold them back, because if you do, I will never know what the truth is. I am aware that what is being reported to me is not true." The king knew when he was lied to.
The light of their life was appearing in person right in front of them. Here was a chance to drive away darkness in which their families had been living. As it happened, they managed to find ways to sidestep the officials and slip the petitions directly to His Majesty.
From what I saw, most of them dressed in tatters, wearing shorts, with a piece of loincloth wrapped at the waist. The government people never took any notice of them. When the king came to the spot where they were waiting, they would just pull out the document concealed somewhere in their cloths and handed it over to him. Of course, no one dared to interrupt. That was how it happened most times. Suddenly, a high-ranking official approached me, asking what I was writing. I said I was writing a petition for the king. Some of the officials there, I will not say their names, tried to stop me, saying I could not do that, not in the world. I said, why indeed not? The people had their woes. They still insisted that I would not be allowed to do it. In any case, I was determined, did manage to lodge the petition too.
Every royal-initiated project constitutes the body of continuous work for His Majesty, because he always monitors its progress and keeps abreast of all the problems or outcomes.
There were instances where His Majesty repeatedly made inquiries as to why certain projects had not got off the ground. He had a complete set of data with him, so he knew everything, the location, the nature of problems applying there, etc. He kept all our reports, plus his own personal information. He even did some spying. He had his own auditors unit out on us.
Nowadays, the hard work has been passed to Her Majesty the Queen and members of the royal family who make royal visits to the sites of the royal-initiated projects, development study centres, as well as certain remote areas. They constantly report their findings to His Majesty.
On Her Majesty's trip, officials from the Irrigation Department had to be in attendance, along with those from the RDPB. After the trip was over, report had to be prepared and submitted to the board. We were told to send the report to Klai Palace for his approval. There were indeed cases that the report was returned to us with his comment, arguing that some things were not right, and the corrections. The point is that His Majesty is still hard at work, even though he now resides at Klai Palace. I can assure you he is.
2006 is the 60th year under His Majesty the King's reign. The words of righteousness uttered as the first vow of his reign have become fundamental in the morals of the Lord of the land, who has been revered for his role as a shelter for his subjects, a pillar for the nation. Under his rule, a lot has been learned as to how development work can thrive without the risk of losing harmony and equilibrium. On that day, 60 years ago, the love of his subject managed to hold the sovereign back. Now, more than 20,000 days later, the sovereign is still returning that love to his subjects.
Nak ayak, tak ada nak ayak suruh tolong batuan ni lah.
Thanks to the king for all he has done to help.
Nak suruh tolong batuan hai tak buat kerja lah.
He helped us in everything. Thank you.
พระองค์ท่านทรงช่วยเหลือประชาราษฎร์ของท่านขอขอบคุณ
I do not know what my love for him is like, but I know I love our king. I wish to let the king know that he is a good king. For all his care, we are blessed with good life, always have water for consumption, rice for every meal.
All through the long years that His Majesty the King has been hard at work for the development and prosperity of our country, he has illustrated the guidelines pertaining to an impressive array of royal-initiated projects. They are invaluable lessons of wisdom which his subjects should strive to familiarise themselves with for their own well-being today and in the years to come.